All right. Well, welcome everyone to the webinar, The Profitability Impact of Self-Supported PostgreSQL. I'm your host today, Dan Ashton, and before we get started, we just have a couple of housekeeping items that we'd like to go over. First of all, the slides and the recording are going to be emailed to you within the next 24 hours or so. And we will be asking you to enter your questions in the Q&A chat box. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A, so please make sure that you enter those in throughout the course of the presentation. If we don't have time to get to your questions, we're going to follow up with you individually. And today's speaker is Jamie Watt. He's the SVP of Support Services. Jamie, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, Dan, you kind of stole my thunder, but as mentioned by Dan, I'm the SVP for Support Service for EDB. Got about 25 years experience in the industry overall, most explicitly around support for the last 17 years, and pretty much worked throughout the entirety of the stack, from infrastructure to database to application.
Hey, terrific. Welcome, Jamie. And this is our agenda that we're going to be going through today. First of all, we're going to find out where everybody is on your Postgres story, and DIY, what matters to you, support partner choices, and making a decision about support. But before we get started, we're gonna talk to this poll here, and we are going to ask you for your input around these questions. So let me get our poll up here. And I'm going to launch this, and the questions are, we're going to give you a few seconds to answer. Where would you describe where you are with Postgres? You're considering Postgres in the future, but early, kind of in the experimental stage. You're actively using it as proof of concept on your own. You're in one or more proof of concept with a chosen support partner. So support partner is the key phrase. You're actively using Postgres in production and you're self-supporting, or you're in production for one or more applications and you've already chosen a support partner. So why don't, if we can get you to go ahead and enter your information in here, that would be great. We'll give you a few more seconds and we're going to close it out. 2, 3, 1. All right. So we're going to end the poll here and let's take a look at some of the results here. So Jamie, we're kind of split between actively using Postgres in production and self-supporting, or in production for one or more applications with a chosen support partner. What did you expect here? What these kind of results?
Yeah, I mean, generally, we tend to see folks that are more towards one of the first two, and then more towards the latter as you're in production. But obviously, I certainly have conversations with organizations of all scales that may either be in the self-support phase or in a state where they're working with one or more partners. So it's interesting to see that we've got kind of a spade across the spectrum of all of those types of personas here, which is great for what we're going to be talking through today.
All right, terrific. So let's move on here. And this, I kind of love and how you've approached this DIY. And if you're not familiar with DIY, do it yourself. Okay, so that's the self-support element. But you've got DIY. So Jamie, what do you mean there?
So what we wanted to get into is what are the reasons why someone would choose DIY over working through a more phased approach with one or more partners, right? And there's often a few different scenarios where we see that as either most compelling or most attractive to the business case at hand, right? So you see low or no risk as a use case, whether it's a small scale implementation for low tier applications or environments in which compliance and uptime are negligible. It could be because they're cold or warm environments for what might be a higher demand production instance. It could simply be that it's more being used for archival needs or something that is, again, less tier 1, tier 2 shaped.
Makes sense.
So then you see those that are certainly in the built by user strategy, right? And that's not necessarily just specific to Postgres. It could be what the overall environment looks like. So you could be making use of things like, from a Kafka Zookeeper perspective, you're looking to have consistency across different types of applications rather than using technologies that are specific to applications, where you might be looking at replication or backup that's specific to an application, to a database, to an appliance, to a cloud provider, right? There could be a corporate mandate for doing that stuff in-house, such that you can leverage that webbing across many different estates, or it may be more oriented around open source ownership, right? So operating a custom fork, or more commonly in that small set of folks that do employ this, compiling it for specialized needs, right? It might be for a very specific platform or computing platform, could be oriented around the operating system, which may not be covered by either community or any of the major providers. But something there is kind of carrying that need to do things in a way which is different than what you see the vast majority of folks leveraging there.
Right.
And then, of course, you've got capability versus cost, right? So you look at the needs from a database tech perspective. They may be minimal, right? So good versus good enough, where there's no compelling requirements for new features and you're really just leveraging the database as it exists, right? The last piece is all data is more treated as point in time, right? So there's no need to handle anything in a persistent manner. ACID compliance isn't necessary. It's really stuff where you're storing the bits in memory effectively, or in the application itself.
Okay, so it's not all about cost then.
Right. It's not always all about cost, right? It's about the use case.
Gotcha.
So if we look at the other side of it, right, the DIY not, there are certainly pieces that are both reflective of what we talked about a minute ago, as well as tangential from it, right? So if you look at modernization as a distraction, where you have in-house experts that are oriented around Postgres, either to, as we were talking about earlier, create a fork, or just to maintain it as your estate, it might dilute the team effort on the outcomes that matter, right? So you're chartered with producing mobile applications, but you might have to straddle Postgres and the community in order to achieve your outcomes because of how you've implemented your database strategy. And with that, where you look at the custom built aspect, you've got the needs that come with that, merging back to community testing, where that's not necessarily being done at scale outside of that selective environment, and feature deviation.
So what you're talking about is how do you allocate your resources, and your strategic initiatives, as you pointed out, might be neglected if you're focused on just maintaining that database.
Absolutely. And this is true for anyone, anywhere in the tech stack, right? So as a database provider, we tend to focus on, obviously, that as our primary tech and everything that's adjacent to it. Now, we're not going to focus and try and create our own accounting application when there's obviously other experts globally and providers and platforms that we can leverage, right? It allows us to not end up in a diluted state. So the next item that we've got is database as a sunken cost, right? So technology investments that require greater team spend in order to grow the business and product roadmaps. This goes back to a little bit of a different perspective of the modernization, where you're looking at having to create features within database technology at the same time that you're actually focused in a less concentrated sense around the entirety of your portfolio. It creates a sunken cost. And this extends to the support of it as well, right? So where you're ensuring that you've got not just the technology that you need, but the solution that you need, the uptime that you require for your overall application or suite of applications. There's a sunken cost there towards not just the testing of the application and the database, but also the solution itself.
Right, that makes sense. I love your database as a sunken cost.
Well, I hate it as a sunken cost, but yeah.
Well,
I think
the
metaphor
phrase.
certainly, yeah, it comes across with a little bit of color, right?
Yeah.
And the last piece was, do it yourself can equal self-supported, which can equal risk in some cases. Questions and guidance, they're kind of tried in the court of opinion rather than answers. There's no shortage of places you can go to ask questions, But when you pose those questions, be it on more kind of I guess casual forums like Reddit or on Stack Overflow, or just posting it in any given search engine, obviously Google for the majority of us, you're going to be receiving a whole bunch of different responses to that, which may or may not actually be the answer that you're looking for your solution or just for the technology in general.
It might have worked for somebody in their particular environment, but your environment, it might not work. Or it might create a bigger problem.
Right, exactly. So a response is not necessarily an answer at scale.
Good point, good point.
The last bit is really the burden of risk and revenue is yours alone, right? So you have no shared responsibility model with any other partner or provider or platform manager that would actually be able to help you through situations as they may arise, right? So when you have those SWAT team war room situations, you may find yourself in a scenario where you're working through, let's say, an advanced recovery effort, but you have no one to turn to ensure that you're able to get back to a resilient state or a whole cloth state.
Yeah, I've got kind of a loaded question for you, I guess.
Sure.
Is that how often do you, or how often do you, sometimes maybe run into somebody who has tried the DIY, the self-supported route, and then found out at a very inopportune moment it's not working and there's a panic?
So thankfully, that's in somewhat of the minority state. Oftentimes, we'll end up getting involved with entities of all sizes that have started out in the DIY state and then ultimately came to the conclusion, either by way of a past event or sequence of scenarios, or just going through their overall compliance framework evaluation, realizing they need that partnership. But where we do see that smaller subset where they find out because it's kind of you whack or you step on the Lego in the middle of the night, it's a situation where as they go through the process, they realize oftentimes the value of working with an organization where their sole focus is really that portion of the technology, right? So where you're looking at, again, things like database recovery, it could be failure for connections, could be pooling and balancing issues, could be just overall SQL performance issues. These are things that certainly are within the bailiwick relative to what you're doing for your application and your solution, but having that database lens brought to it by someone whose whole organization's purpose is centered around that technology really helps to bring about a healthier solution, right? Because to your point that you made a moment ago, we're not just focused on addressing the symptom, we're also focused on understanding what is causing the symptom, which may or may not be the equivalent, right? There might actually be tangential issues that are driving the symptoms that are being observed.
Gotcha. Which sort of leads us into some of the other parts of risk.
Right. So if you look at the estimate here from Gartner, on average, every minute of downtime can cost up to $300,000 US an hour. Now, where it may not be only the database that is in play here, and certainly isn't in the entirety of a solution, if the database is unavailable, either because there's an issue with the database or because access to it, maybe there's a saturation of connections, could be an issue with CPU, all of these things ultimately equate to the application being unavailable to some, many, or all, right? And that can have severe consequences for the business.
Yeah, and obviously your mileage may vary on this. Larger company is maybe going to see more of a hit than 300K per hour, and smaller, maybe not quite as big. But in addition, you've also got reputation, which I think you're going to talk about.
Absolutely.
So alternatives, where do you go from here?
Great question. So there's two primary profiles that you see, right? And you want to understand whether you're considering at scale, and it could be both, by the way, a consulting partner or a platform provider. And you kind of want to go through an analysis of understanding the risk, the approach, and obviously how the software and the approach to it is embodied by whomever it is you're partnering with. If you look at consulting, it's certainly focused around the project orientation of it, right? So if you look at the partner platforming, you actually see support focused around a resilient and thorough set of processes. So the consequence of that, or the benefits, right? If you look at the risk associated to a consulting partner, 24/7 is more on a customer by customer basis, where you're structuring things almost on a tailored need based off of each customer. So it's not necessarily something that is built for scale across the entirety of, let's say, a large customer base. Compliance also isn't necessarily a given, right? Because where you're not necessarily operating at scale, you may only be operating, let's say, in one region or one province, one country, whatever it might be. Your lens is going to be more focused or that particular consultation partner may be more focused around serving that locale, that vertical, that industry, whatever it might be, rather than kind of stretching across the entirety of what you see for Postgres users. Platform providers are more focused around scale, right? So not just the supportability, but the development, right, to 5 nines effectively. Making sure the capability and compliance are there and accessible across all customers is by design. As I mentioned, the consulting partners are more oriented, generally speaking, around project capability. So that a project may be perceived as a single customer or a project within a customer, where we're talking about going through a proof of concept or bringing one application to production state, or maybe migrating an application or a suite of applications. It's more strategically oriented around that particular need, right? Which really drives to a tactical outcome. The team scale, again, is oriented around that tactical structure of a project focus. Whereas you look at the platform provider, it's generally going to look at a scalable model, globally capable, 24/7 availability, making sure that there's a host of resources available to solve issues, no matter what time of day, date, day, et cetera. And there's an organizational scale to it, right? So making sure that it's not just someone to pick up the proverbial phone or to answer a ticket, but making sure that you've got the right type of resources around that. Lastly, and really this kind of serves as the bedrock to how, especially the large scale deployments need to look at this, is, are you approaching this overall effort as a tactical initiative, or something where you need to be able to ingest open source as a product, right? So are you looking to have a provider that is going to be limited in break fix and test validation, right? Because of the scale of the overall engagement. And they may also be approaching your problems symptomatically. As we mentioned a few minutes ago, symptoms do not necessarily equate to cause, but when you're focused on that very narrow lens, it might actually be how the remedy is approached. Now, if you're approaching open source as a product, right, as a platform provider would, then they should be community strong, right? Have a presence in the community, have an integral way of not just receiving input from the community, but also giving it back and making sure that we have synchronicity there. They should be roadmap oriented, right? So making sure that we're driving towards what the outcomes are needed in terms of not just break fix or defects, but also how are we encouraging innovation, right? So as a provider, you want to make sure that that provider is not just bringing kind of the patchwork, but also a broader sense of what the overall tapestry can and could look like. They will be focused on fixing symptoms, but they're also going to be focused at the same time on ensuring that fix is also an employable fix as a scaled cause analysis.
So if my tire is flat and I just put air in it, yeah, I fixed the symptom, right? But I didn't necessarily patch the hole, and it's going to get flat again, right?
Right. Yeah, the patch on the tire doesn't get rid of the glass on the road.
Exactly. Okay. Terrific. So tell us more about a platform.
So if you're looking at platform partners, you've got the people and process, right? So you've got people that should absolutely be Postgres experts, right? So certainly we can speak to that from an EDB perspective, but that's just a base level expectation. 24/7 coverage should be driven by a global, or at least a globally available model, right? It shouldn't be a consequence of paging, either by way of something like PagerDuty or in the literal sense, folks to get coverage on a given issue. And certainly it shouldn't look anything like getting a DBA out of bed at 2 in the morning. Making sure that there's an understanding of response and remedy SLOs, right? What are the service level objectives, and what's the commitment that that vendor puts in front of you as a partner to make sure that you're getting what you need in terms of remedy, as well as long-term solutions, responses, et cetera. Follow the sun, again, making sure it's 24/7. There is no gap in coverage. It's not a consequence of one region being available versus another. And oh, by the way, there should be a seamless experience irrespective of where those team members are, right? So if you have an issue that is, let's say, all hands on deck, there's not a visible pain in the experience of that information and experience being handed off as things move around, where they may extend past, one individual shift. And best practices and guidance, right? Making sure that you can provide not just a remedy to any given customer, but also that you're able to provide the breadth of experience and exposure that you've had from a Postgres perspective, and distill that into advice as well as guidance in terms of, it could be configuration, could be base level solution recommendations, could be oriented around specific extensions, just a whole lot of capability, which equates to a question being asked and an answer being provided, rather than a need being presented and opinions being, kind of the swarming mechanism.
Does that mean they could just call up and ask a question about, should I do this or that, before a big problem occurs?
Absolutely. So the best providers really should be focused on a call early, call often. Obviously, call is not necessarily the best metaphor or the best verb in
Okay, contact.
But yes, contact, outreach, engagement is absolutely something where it's better to have a relationship where you're able to get recommendations and guidance before you actually produce outcomes that might have problems.
Terrific. And speaking of outcomes.
Well, where you're looking at the platform provider or the platform partner, you should see a reduction of risk, right? So if you do run into a problem, what are the consequences of that need, right? What do you see in terms of service level objectives? What's the commitment? What does that look like in terms of providing a remedy or a long-term resolution? You should see a decrease in your downtime, right? So again, if you have the right partner, then the solution is going to be designed in a way where it's not only, right to fit out of the box, but it's also going to be something where there's resiliency that's designed around it, whether we're talking about backup and recovery or replication and redundancy and availability. Overhead should be something that is also reduced as a consequence, right? So we were talking several minutes ago about databases and sunken cost. Well, where you're able to leverage that relationship with a platform partner, then you're able to leverage the experience of those who are, senior level consultants, as well as those who are subject matter experts, and those who are kind of the surgeons to jump in at the point of need, rather than having to replicate that formula within your own team. Lastly, reallocation of resources. Again, we talked about the sunken costs. We talked about whether or not you have to have a completely self-sufficient team that is going to drive not just your outcomes around solution availability, but also in terms of patching, in terms of testing. All of these things can ultimately be partnered with or actually offset by the partner entirely.
Now, Jamie, you've talked about SLOs a couple of times. I certainly have heard about response SLOs or SLAs. Not very much about remedy. So what are some, I would say industry leading SLOs that people ought to look for? And what is a remedy in SLO?
Sure. So if we look at a remedy actually restores functionality, right? At least from the perspective of what that partner is chartered with. As an example, EDB and certainly the Postgres database and its solution. What is industry leading does vary based off of the type of provider that you're working with. If you look at Postgres or database specifically, I guess, in a broader sense, oftentimes you'll see remedy either absent from the targets or goals or loosely stated. What you should be looking for is the candid, transparent SLOs that are really just provided upfront, right? So if it's a severity one issue, you either have, let's say, unavailability, you've got corruption, whatever that might be. what is the vendor's commitment in terms of providing a remedy, right? So ensuring that there's restoration of functionality, as well as, if relevant, a long-term fix, right? Part of that does wrap into whether you're dealing with a fork or you're dealing with something that is purely within PostgreSQL and the community itself. But what is that vendor's commitment to you, and how is that stratified across different severity levels, right? So a severity 1 issue, you need to make sure that you've got remedy inside of. Could be hours, could be a day. Again, that provider should be able to answer you in a way that is not necessarily just, it depends. They should be able to provide you with what's effectively a matrix of, this is what we do for these severity levels in these types of environments, and here's how we do this to you at scale.
Sounds like a good approach. Oh, wait a minute. Somehow we apologize for that. Moved forward a little too fast. So this looks like an interesting example.
So we did bring up a specific example that we wanted to kind of demonstrate what happens when you see these situations come up, and how SLOs and the involvement from the provider play right into it. So in this particular example, there was a customer that had a severity 1 issue where the PG wall directory of their standby servers was just exploding, right? Not in the literal sense, but in terms of capacity. And you can run into a couple of different scenarios where that results in the database being unavailable. What happened here was, the ticket was created by the customer. That happened at, as you see here, 5:53 UTC. Now, the space on the actual standby servers was just, again, increasing at a rapid pace. That created a load on the disk. It created a load on the servers themselves, and produced a situation where there was potentially going to be a shutdown with data loss because of how they had replication configured. That's a whole other piece that your vendors should be able to ensure that you have done appropriately. We're not going to get into that too much here, but there are a lot of different ways that you can configure replication to make sure that you've got the best sort of availability versus resiliency. So when we went through the initial response, which was less than 20 minutes later, right? Just over 10 minutes later, requested for specific types of logs, as well as understanding the parameters, and specifically requesting what we call lasso reports, which is focused around configuration, right? So again, it's the vendor working with the customer, making sure you're getting a very lightweight set of requirements, so that way you can solve the problem in the most tactical, appropriate manner. So after going through and realizing in a live engagement that the production itself wasn't compromised, we did classify this as Sev2. That allows us to follow the sun, work with consistent, reliable resources across that arc, but ensure that we're also viewing it through the proper lens. So going through the response and analysis, within 30 minutes, we were able to get the additional details and understood that the cluster status itself, which was being indicated by the wall files, they were copying to the standby servers, but they weren't going through the full replay state. There was a handoff, because again, you should see that in a platform approach with a provider, to make sure that we actually were bringing this over to the next engineer who's going to be working the issue seamlessly. Now, manually going through and running a select to ensure that we did a wall replay resume was done on the standby servers. We did go through and suggest a method for evaluating whether or not this solution was really right for them. Do you have the checkpoints configured correctly? Do you really have replication configured in a way that's best for the environment, right? Where we see kind of the delay in replays, as well as best for the needs of the application. Now, this was confirmed at that point that this did work, right? This got us to a point where we had remedy. And if you look at the total elapsed time, we're just over an hour and a half at this point. So customer was able to get engaged with their vendor, which is us as their partner in the situation. And the total time to remedy it's just under 2.5 hours. Fantastic outcome, given what we saw when we got data, when we were able to take action and ultimately provide remedy to the customer. Now there's follow-up that happens, right? And you should again see this with any provider, making sure that we're not just addressing that symptom in the moment, but ensuring that longer term, this is addressing what is potentially the cause underneath. Again, we had made some recommendations around how to change the solution, but also making sure the symptoms don't crop back up is key to ensuring that you have a successful outcome with the customer.
That's kind of unusual. A lot of times you call support, I don't care whether it's my cell phone or anything else. Can I close this ticket? They jump on it instead of suggesting, let's leave it open a little while longer. That seems like a very client-centric type of support.
Yeah, that's really the goal, right? Because ultimately, things like KPIs, right, key performance indicators, they're there to help you stay on the road. They're not necessarily there to navigate where you need to go, right? So the experience that you have as a customer is first and foremost. So if a platform provider comes to you and just shows you kind of a swath of SLOs or a swath of their statistics without really being able to tell the story behind it, that should raise a flag.
Mm. So that brings us to the audience here. The participants, where are they in, each of you in your journey? It goes back to our poll. Are you running business critical applications on Postgres? Does your organization, and I guess I'd probably expand from what you have said, Jamie, across your organization, do you have the skills and expertise? It's not just one guy, right? Or one person, right? Do you have the resources and budget, which is in addition to taking care of your support issues, but are you able to, with your support being taken care of, be able to look at strategic initiatives, other things that need to be addressed where your current allocation of resources may not be 100% appropriate, which is the next slide here, the next bullet, excuse me. So we didn't talk a lot about this, Jamie, but compliance requirements, SOX, FIPS, ISO, that people have to, maybe you either have to have vendor support or partner support, or you've got to disclose self-supported systems. And can you speak to that at all a little bit more?
Sure. So, I mean, if you have these in your environments, then you're certainly familiar with what they mean to you. But really what you should be keying in on when you're working with potential partners is whether or not they really understand the context of what it means to them and how they can actually help to strengthen your posture, whether we're talking about something like SOX and FIPS, or we're talking about ISO or SOC 2, right? Some of those models are oriented around risk management versus risk mitigation. Those are two very different things, right? You look at a shared responsibility model, and you're certainly looking at whether or not you can treat, if you look at HIPAA, for an example, right? You can treat a handler or a processor as an actual business associate, right? If they are able to understand that and they can lucidly detail to you what is and is not within their scope of capability, then that's certainly a green flag at that point, right? They may not have all the answers, but being able to speak to it beyond just a label is critical, especially when you're dealing with scenarios that require, it could be certain specific requirements around privacy. It could be specific requirements around medical privacy. Again, HIPAA could be oriented around controls within an ISO 27K framework. Could be specific to SOC 2, right? Understanding what that partner's capability levels are and their overall awareness of what the frameworks require from them is key. This is something that is generally going to be specific based off of what you see around the maturity of either a given application or just where you are in your overall product strategy. And it may not be product, right? Could be looking to environments that are oriented around government, administration, civil needs, whatever it could be. But understanding what the requirements are is really key from a compliance perspective to make sure that you don't have kind of a hidden risk at play.
Makes sense. And then lastly, and this is a biggie here, is what is the risk to the company? Your organization, if it is a business critical application and you've got an outage, we've talked to the element of finances, the revenue, but it can be a lot more long lasting than that when it comes to your reputation in the marketplace. So some terrific insights, Jamie. Really appreciate you walking through this for our friends here on the call today, the webinar. Tell us a little bit more about you, your team, and what's happening at EDB for support.
Sure, I'll try to do so without being too self-congratulatory. But what you should see and what we have within EDB is understanding that the delivery should be purpose fit for the journey for each and every one of you, and obviously any given customer. And they should be able to back that with measures and outcomes, right? So where we talked about the more practical example with the wall replay issue, we see that at scale, right? So whether we're talking about answering just customers on questions, or we're working through, kind of in the trenches with a customer on an issue of any severity level, making sure that you can actually demonstrate what that looks like at scale. 96% customer satisfaction is pretty hard to achieve, but it's impossible to achieve if you're really just focused on the number itself. It's more around the experience, right? Understanding how you deliver the experience that is going to help each and every one of you certainly achieve what you need from your technology provider. So last year we had about 7,600 cases, a little bit over 7,600 unique cases. Now that ignores the tens of thousands of alerts that we work through with our proactive support customers, but specifically we're working through things that are oriented around, could be break fix, could be oriented around questions, answers, guidance, best practices. That's really what we saw as we closed out 2022. Of that, we had 569 issues that, from the customer's viewpoint, was a severity 1 issue, right? So the database was presenting itself potentially as unavailable. Again, that could be a consequence of pooling, could be a consequence of load balancing, could be issues with the wall replay, how replication's configured, whole lot of things at play. But what's important is understanding that from the customer perspective, right, the solution saw that as a Sev 1. Now, where we saw those 569 Sev 1s, we had 738 Zooms. This is a huge tell from a provider. If there is a lot of framework that prevents or at least creates drag in leading up to a point where you're engaged with that vendor in what you view to be the most effective way, as an example, Zoom or Teams, whatever it might be, then that's a flag. For us, it's a matter of making sure that we're providing the answer and the collaboration in the medium that is best attuned to the need, right? So if you're dealing with something that's severity 4, could be severity 3 with low priority, then going back and forth just through a ticket more in a passive sense could be the right answer. But if it's something where it's severity 2 or 1 and it's really affecting your solution, then you need to have that immediacy from your provider to make sure that you've got the commitment to drive through the outcomes you need. So we've got over 300 Postgres engineers throughout this company where we're looking at development or support senior resources. We've got over 110 within support itself. And of the 110, there's several dozen that are actually contributing actively to either EDB tooling or community projects. And by the way, while we're talking about contributors in general, you've got 41 Postgres contributors across the EDB teams. Now, those 41 contributors and obviously the 300 Postgres engineers are actually driving outcomes and availability and just the necessary partnership across over 1,500 customers globally. Of those 1,500 customers, 70 plus are actually Fortune 500. We do this by driving the right level of capability within our teams, but also making sure that what we deliver as a package is really kind of the solution as needed by the customers. So if you look on the left-hand side, making sure that what we offer is really attuned to an at-scale need. Are we looking at basic needs that might be more akin to development type questions? Production, where you have an environment that is, let's say, tier 2, has specific requirements, needs to make sure it has a mature vendor behind it. Or premium, where you have the same sort of maturity that is needed behind it, but also a high sense of immediacy. These are all different ways in which we deliver those outcomes to customers through technical support. And in a more proactive manner, where you see the dotted line and remote DBA at play here, There's an additional level that we can take where we're looking at things proactively, where we're monitoring and managing in addition to providing responsive support.
Okay, terrific. Sounds like a great team. These are for folks who are not familiar with EDB. These are just a few of our select clients, a few of those 1,500 clients that are available. I'm sure that you can notice a few recognizable logos. And with that, we're going to launch into Q&A. Now, again, if you have a question that you would like to ask, please put that into our Q&A chat box. And anyone that would like to contact us, you can see the information for us at the contact us page on enterprisedb.com. You'll also be getting an email in the next 24 hours or so with this presentation and a link to the recording. So, Jamie, let's jump into some of these Q&A questions here. Let's see. So Hassam is asking, why does decreased downtime lead to a better outcome? Or why decreased downtime lead to a better outcome? So, Jamie, I'm not sure I totally understand, but go ahead, maybe you do.
So there's a couple different ways you can look at downtime, right? There's planned downtime versus unplanned, where you have outages. Right. Unplanned downtime or outages, that's probably a fairly transparent example of where that's a better outcome, given that it allows for better availability of whatever solution you're working to maintain. Where you're looking at downtime that may be decreased in a planned or maintenance sense, the goal isn't necessarily to decrease that unless that's the goal of the environment, right? So CI/CD environments might actually require it to be continually available, and downtimes are going to be pieces that kind of move discretely throughout the solution. So you see, as an example, standbys being upgraded, handling seamless availability from the primary perspective. That's an example of a decreased downtime where you're not having to take a full maintenance window and as a consequence, potentially take the application offline to deliver the resiliency or the currency to the solution and the software behind it.
Okay, terrific. Next is, okay, it's Hassam again. Which version is more suitable for sensitive production setup? Question mark. PostgreSQL open source protected with EDB support, or I have to consider an EDB version, I assume version of software proprietary.
Sure. So there are a few pieces around that, and it depends on what level of compliance is required for that sensitive information, right? So do you need things like transparent data encryption, right? If so, then yes, that's more oriented around an EDB type solution, although there are aggressive efforts in terms of bringing more of that capability into the broader community as well. If you're looking at redaction or you're looking at obfuscation, there are features that you do have to weigh and work with that platform partner to understand what's going to best suit what that application's need is. As an example, does the application naturally handle obfuscation when it's working with data to the database itself, right? Or is it expecting that to be handled within the database, right? We see both of those needs come across in solutions when customers come to us specifically. And it's a matter of understanding what is expected and what also is required from a compliance perspective to make sure that you get the right outcome in terms of the right sensitivity and, oh, by the way, the resiliency of that sensitivity. So if there's a failover, you shouldn't have risk in terms of compliance or sensitivity not necessarily being handled seamlessly from the original state to the failover state.
Okay, and now Anne is asking, is there some ways that we can understand what type of partner or provider that we're working with?
Absolutely. So given the community is as open as it is, you should be able to ask questions like, who do you have working in the community? How many people do you have that are active in the community? What's the size of your organization? And more specifically, what is the size of the organization that's going to provide support to me, right? What's the size of the development capability within that organization? And understanding whether those resources are discrete or separate is also key, right? So that way you don't, if the answer is 100, 100, 100, it's not the same 100 people in all examples, right? You're able to understand the better description of the breadth of the organization and what they're able to bring to you in terms of resiliency and ultimately dynamic capability around things like the roadmap as well.
Okay. Next, as Peter is asking, do you have industry metrics around what it costs organizations to self-support their open source database environments, and how would those numbers compare with support from a third party?
So there are industry numbers around what it costs a company to drive open source just in general, particularly if they're going from a closed source scenario to open source. That's more focused broadly on open source, and it does equate to a significant percentage of someone's overall IT or DevOps capability. Do we have hard numbers around that specific to Postgres? No, not at hand. I could certainly give you estimates, right? Where we walk through examples here and we talk about what self-support really means, right? Are we talking about patching it ourselves? Are we talking about an active fork or potentially a separate compilation? If we're talking just about use of Postgres itself, I think ultimately what it comes down to is what is the comfort level around risk, and where you look at that cost, does it make sense to take that on, not just in terms of the cost of the resources, but the cost of potential outcomes where you have a finite number of team members who may or may not be fully exclusive to just Postgres, but they're going to have a wheelhouse that is their expertise. It's the everything that surrounds them that is really the incalculable risk that you take on as a cost when you're trying to do things via the self-support motion. Now, that might be mitigable if you look at lower tier applications or cold scenarios, but you have to be extremely cognizant of what that cost is to you and whether or not it really balances out in the long run versus working with someone whose entire business is surrounding that technology which you need.
Okay, and Dave's asking, should the size of the application matter whether or not you go self-support or with a partner?
I think the size is important. Equally important is the design of the solution itself. The design of the solution is going to determine whether or not size is going to create a tipping point. Some of the famous examples that you can look to certainly include, as an example, Uber, right? They had made a transition away from Postgres a few years ago, very publicly. But what that came down to was the design of the solution. Had it been designed differently, and there were a number of blogs about this as well, then their scale would not have led to the outcomes that they experienced, in spite of the enormity, right? It comes down to design, whether or not you can fit 20 people into one car versus actually having a caravan are going to have two very different outcomes.
Gotcha, makes sense. And we got one more question here. And again, put it in the chat box if you'd like to get your question answered. So how do we balance between a vendor who can help versus a vendor lock-in?
Great question. That actually tails back to something that Hassam had asked a minute ago. So if you're looking at a vendor that is going to be able to provide a solution that is most flexible for you, they should be able to explain to you and understand what the context is. And by the way, these should come up in the questions they ask you as well. What is the experience you're looking for, right? Do you need something that is fully open source by way of mandate or edict from a corporate initiative? Or do you have flexibility there? And finding the solution that best fits your needs from a technology perspective and an overall initiative perspective really should be what you're looking to see from that partner, right? It shouldn't be I guess, an overburdened push into something that might have a bunch of functionality you might not have use for. It should be something that really solves what you are looking for, and potentially even looks to explore things that you only uncover as potential needs down the road as a consequence of that partnership.
All right. Well, terrific. Jamie, thank you so much for your insights today. And please, folks, feel free to reach out if you've got additional questions or would like to connect with EDB about your support. I will mention, too, there is one ebook that folks might be interested in viewing that is on our website, and that is the six telltale signs you should be rethinking your Postgres support. Might be of interest if for folks who have been attending this particular webinar. We want to thank you very much for your time today. Thank you, Jamie, and have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks, everyone. Take care.